Okay, so this is part two of semester one review. I got cut off right as I was talking about World War One, so I'll just quickly recap where I was. You'll need to know the four main causes: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. You'll need to know the two alliances, and I didn't mention this in the other video, but the two alliances being uh, starting with France and teaming up on the Entente, France, Great Britain, and Russia, which encircled Germany and made Germany kind of an outsider. And so Germany then forms in the Triple Alliance, or also called the Central Powers, with Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, which is modern-day Turkey. And so we've got these two alliances before the war ever even starts, and that causes a lot of tension. And then I mentioned in the last video the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie of Austria-Hungary by the Serbian nationalist, and Russia vows to support any Slavs. And the Gavrilo Princip, he was a Serbian Slav who was he was acting in rebellion to the powers of the Austro-Hungarian throne, who were oppressing his people, and they wanted independence from them. And so Russia said that they would support Serbia, and that causes a problem because France said they'd support Russia. Germany said they would support Austria-Hungary. And so we've got this issue that might have only been between two countries that is now a global issue and a global conflict, and this brings in all of these territories that are supporting their country through imperialism, and so, or their motherland through imperialism, and so this is going to be a global war. Okay, at home we've got the Great Migration, so African Americans are moving out of the South into the North. The North isn't necessarily paradise, but it does provide more work. It also provides kind of an escape from the Jim Crow laws that are in the South. There is still discrimination and prejudice, but it is better than in the South. The Selective Service Act is going to be instituted, the draft, and the draft is going to be used in World War I to call up men for military service. The Espionage and Sedition Act, this was what some people felt like was controversial in that it and some people felt like limited their freedom of speech. The Espionage and Sedition Act targeted people who spoke out against the war and would have either fined or imprisoned them for being anti-war during World War I and considered possibly a spy. The United States had to provide for the war in multiple ways. One way, the government encouraged the average American to conserve what they were eating through rationing. Also, conservation went in other ways too. It was other areas, whether that be manufacturing conservation, so that some of those products could be, and production lines could be changed into war-making materials. The government also issued war bonds, which were essentially loans that people could give money to the government. The government would pay them back after the war, but that money would go to support the war. The war ended with the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was a controversial treaty because it didn't really end the conflict, it only fueled more conflict. And so the issues with the Treaty of Versailles were that it essentially blamed Germany for the war, and then that it also crippled their economy through having to pay the war reparations, the war debt. And so this is going to lead to conflicts that are later going to be considered the start of World War I. All right, so we're going to move into the Great Depression, and there's more in this unit on the test than the other units since this was our last one. We also didn't have a unit test over the Great Depression, and so this is where you're going to be tested over the Great Depression. And so there's actually several slides for the Great Depression because there are more things that you'll need to know for this test on the Great Depression. So after World War I, we're going to lead into the 1920s, and the 1920s are a really good time for the United States as far as the economy goes. The United States also is considered a world power after that point on the international stage, is with the contributions to World War I. The United States is just prosperous. It's considered a time of prosperity. And so we're also going to see consumerism, and people are buying in new ways. Because of industrialization, there's all kinds of products being produced. And so we're going to see this movement into overproduction. I don't think people will really understand until the Great Depression happens, but there's going to be more available than there is a demand by the end of the 1920s. Um, the average person is contributing to the economic problems during this time period by buying on margin. Buying on margin is when you buy on loan. So you pay a down payment and then you essentially just pay for a portion of it and you don't pay for all of it. Um, Also, oh, I'm sorry, I have a mistake on here. It should be buying on margin and credit. People are also using the method of credit, which is buy now and pay later. And so you can purchase things that you don't essentially have the money for right now. This will be an issue. Some people choose to purchase stock on margin, which is not a good idea. Taking out a loan from the bank, investing in the stock market, which is not guaranteed that you'll get a profit from. And so if you lose your money investing in that business, then some people could be unable to pay the bank back. There's also some issues going on. There's no regulations for banks on as far as what and how much to loan. And so there are lots of loans going out that banks are giving. And whenever we see the stock market crash, loans aren't being repaid. And so people don't have any protection on that. And we'll get to the end of the Great Depression when we talk about how banks became, how laws changed for banks. But those were some of the issues that were leading to the Great Depression. Whenever the stock market crashed on Black Tuesday, it leads into a decade of economic downturn. In the 1930s, here are some of the economic statistics. So the unemployment rate, meaning the number of people who don't have jobs, gets to an all-time high, 25%. Or 24.9, which is about a quarter of Americans do not have jobs. And that is a really scary situation. It's actually even higher for minorities. For African Americans, the unemployment rate was 50%, 1 out of every 2. And so that was incredible, incredibly bad. The Great Depression is also going to see, once we hit the 1930s, production will decrease. CPI, which is the Consumer Price Index, will show that deflation, which deflation is not a good thing when prices are falling and people still cannot afford to pay the prices even when they're falling. And so the economic depression is going to lead to a lot of hardships. So even people who were not invested in the stock market are going to experience hardships. People go to the banks to withdraw money and the banks have no money. Banks end up closing their doors, and people who never invested in the stock market go to the bank and their savings is gone. And that was because banks were loaning out money that they were not having money come back in return to pay off those loans. As far as people hit the hardest, I mentioned this earlier, but I mean, everyone is impacted by the Great Depression. Everyone. Minorities, because of the inequality of the time period, will be first to be laid off and lose their jobs. But and as I mentioned, African Americans experience a 50% unemployment rate. And so hardship is going to be seen across the board, but really hit minorities very hard. Another hardship of the Great Depression that is unrelated to the economic side is the Dust Bowl. It just so happens that at the same time period, there's an environmental crisis in the plains, and that is the Dust Bowl. You need to know the causes of the Dust Bowl, that it just so happens there's a severe drought during this time period. And with the advancement of technology and farming equipment, the farmers are able to till up the land at a much quicker rate and much larger acreage. And so there's before this, it was much harder. I mean, you would have to take a horse and a plow to plow up the ground, but farmers are now using mechanical equipment that are able to till up the ground. And so by tilling up the ground to farm, we have this loose soil. And when they plant the seeds, their hope is that the crops will grow, but because of the drought, the crops don't grow, and this land, all the soil is exposed. The ground is very dry. There's no roots holding down that ground anymore. And then when the winds pick up, it picks up this soil, and the soil just hangs in the air as dust clouds and dust storms. And this lasts about a decade. People try to leave to go out to California, but it's going to be a huge problem for the plains, and that is the Dust Bowl. Okay, you do need to know the difference between the two presidents who were in office during the Great Depression. President Hoover is going to be blamed a lot for the Great Depression, though his mentality was not necessarily that he didn't care about people, but he didn't feel like it was the government's role to help people during the Great Depression. His mentality was a self-help mentality. He wanted businesses and charities to help the common average person suffering from the Great Depression. He didn't feel like, he called it a volunteerism. He wanted people to step up and help one another, and not the government. His idea was that the government should not spend money to try to alleviate the depression, but that people should help people, that businesses should help people, that charities should help people. It didn't really give anyone any relief, and so people blamed him. The homeless areas or homeless villages were called Hoovervilles, kind of poking at him and blaming him. He also had a really unfortunate incident that happened at the end of his presidency that really sealed the deal, that people really did not want him to be reelected. The Bonus Army was a group of military veterans from World War I who wanted to receive their bonuses. They were supposed to get financial support in the 1940s is when they were supposed to get it. And they wanted it early because of this depression. They wanted to get the financial support from the government before it was due. And so they had a protest in Washington, D.C., and President Hoover gave it over to General MacArthur to try to get the protesters to leave, and it ended up being handled really poorly. The camp was burned down, and this just looked really poorly on President Hoover, that he would, and it was General MacArthur, but people looked at Hoover as the person who did this, and so they blamed him, and so that also did not look very good on President Hoover. He's going to run for re-election, but President Roosevelt will be re-elected in 1932. So President Roosevelt is going to come into office and have a completely different viewpoint. He's going to look at this as the government's job to help, and so we call this direct relief, when the government aids support to people in need and gives them the support they need. He has the 3 R's, and I have a mistake here. His 3 R's are relief, recovery, and reform. And in his first 100 days of office, so right when he gets into office, he starts putting forth programs to help. And so this is going to be money spent, government money spent. He calls it the New Deal, and the New Deal were tons and tons of programs, and I just listed a few. A government program that still exists today is Social Security, and this was a program that was created to help elderly Americans who were leaving the workforce or were aged out of the workforce, and they, during the Great Depression, were suffering because they had no ability to work or would not be hired because of their age, and so Social Security was a way for the government to help those who are aged out of the workforce to still have an income. The WPA was the Works Progress Administration, and this was a government-created program that gave jobs to people to create buildings and bridges and roadways and the infrastructure in cities. And so the government paid people to create just buildings and things that cities needed. The CCC was the Civilian Conservation Corps, and this was a group where men, if they wanted to be a worker on this program, you would go work out in like the woods, essentially, and you would help plant trees, or you would cut down trees to allow for any kind of, whether it be bridges or whether it be, electrical lines or something, or railroads or something going through you. It was working out in the environment. They lived in camps, they got food, they got clothing, and they were paid to go work out in the woods. The FDIC was a program for banks that protected your money in the bank. So if you have money in the bank, you would be insured that no matter what the bank did, you would be insured up to $250,000 regardless, so you would not lose your money. Even with all these programs, though, they did give confidence in President Roosevelt and in the economy, and people appreciated this, and there were jobs that were created, but the production for war materials in World War I is what's going to really pull GDP up and really going to pull people and pull us out of this economic depression. And so we point to World War I as this event that really led to the end of the Great Depression. And that's it. If you guys watch this and you have questions, reach out to me or one of your teachers for help, but that should get you set for the semester test.